And to give you a highlight about that, I may have some of the details sketchy because as we kind of tell a lot of the details, it gets to be like a fish story as time goes on, things get embellished. But I distinctly remember hearing about there was a collapsed bridge and there was an individual entrapped in a car under the bridge for 3 days. And the emergency medical services finally was able to extricate this person. They got him out of the car, and en route to the hospital, he arrested and died with a myocardial infarction. And that instant really was the spark for kind of forming the nidus of how important it was to bring medical care to entrapped victims because of the development of crush injury. Even him sitting in the car, not with anything crushing him, just the fact that he was sitting, unable to move, totally entrapped for 3 days, that was a huge setup to develop crush syndrome, which is precisely why he died en route to the hospital. And we'll talk about that as we go on with this. This is mostly related to mass disasters, although just the experience of urban search and rescue teams has come closer to home because a federal response actually cannot be counted upon to get quickly to a collapsed structure. It usually takes a while for everything to get going and to get to a place of need. And here in South Florida, we are just impact city for having hurricanes, which is certainly the natural disasters. You know, we also have the tornado belt and the travesties of the World Trade Center and the Alfred Murrah building on our own soil. So it's important to kind of think about how the disaster unfolds. And I'll kind of go through that a little bit briefly. If I'm not sure you can see my mouse, but at the top, our response is under FEMA operations. And you have a disaster. And then as you follow along the right side of these arrows, first of all, you have local response, you have the mayor, you have the governor, they request help from the local FEMA directors, and that goes on up to a presidential response on our soil to allocate resources. So all of those things have to fall into play, and then teams disperse. So in the emergency support functions, everything has a number, and you'll see this if you start looking into the disaster response in our country. But you have different numbers for transportation, communications, public works, engineering. You can read these, firefighting specifically. And number 9 is the one that we're going to be talking about, is urban search and rescue. But when you think about the complexity of the disaster response, it is huge. This is one of the situations where it's almost nice to be a peon at the lower level of response because there are so many moving parts, and one only has to turn on the news to just pull Katrina out of the, kind of out of the box, so much bad press, and we didn't do this correctly, and we can poke holes in a lot of response factors. But when one really drills down to figure out all of the moving parts that have to come together, it is a huge undertaking. So the disaster response resources, we in South Florida are extremely fortunate to have a very ramped up local emergency medical services system. Our fire rescue folks are very well organized, and we're fortunate. Sometimes in the more rural areas, not so fortunate. There's more of a length for response. And for any of you that are international, you have your own inherent response that works under a different system. But even our FEMA sponsored USAR teams can work with international USAR teams under the international response. But that makes things even more complex because there are a lot of people communicating at the top to try to, kind of come up with a very fine-tuned disaster response. We have mutual aid, we have state resources, we have the National Guard. And the other thing that I'll throw in here that over the years, even my experience started on our USAR team in 1994. And when the physician joins the team, we are considered a medical manager. What they've recognized is there's a huge need for USAR teams, state urban search and rescue teams. And so there's a whole arm that just deals with the state teams. And the reason for that is, this picture is reminiscent of the response to the Pentagon. So local responses move forward, but the state can allocate resources even a little bit more quickly than federal teams that have to come probably from several states away or many states away, or even international coming on our soil to help us out, which kind of refers to the outside medical rescue teams. So what exactly is an urban search and rescue team task force? I'm referring to the FEMA Federal Task Force. It is an 80-member unit. When I joined the team, it was a 70-member unit, and we had to ramp things up because there need to be drivers for all of the equipment that is kind of geared up. And the whole purpose of the team is to arrive quickly, safely, and be able to hit the ground running with urban search and rescue operations. We are expected, it is a deployment. It functions very much like the military. And as soon as the notification comes through where the team is activated, the task force is expected to be, I'll say wheels up, but out the door in 6 hours. Now, most of the time in the United States, we're by ground. Our Task Force 2 is not an international team, but since Haiti was so very close to South Florida, both South Florida federal teams responded to Haiti. There are 2 FEMA teams who are considered to be international response, and they have other requirements in order for them to pursue that. And I thought this is a little fuzzy, I think, but if you see in the bottom, we have not changed the number of the federal USAR task forces. There are 28 in total. And California, quite obviously, is pretty fulfilled with having a preponderance of FEMA teams because of the earthquake experience. And we have our 2 in South Florida and then kind of scattered around. So 28 teams, and all are under the federal response. They get reviewed. They have, just making sure that everybody is kind of towing the mark, so to speak, and meeting requirements. The teams are expected to have 24-hour operations. And what that generally means is that the 80-person team will split into 2 and do Alpha and Bravo or day and night shifts. Sometimes it doesn't function that way, depending upon whatever the mission is. The entire team may work together and then break for what usually is the Bravo shift at night and then resume on the next day. And it is very multidisciplinary. All of these entities are kind of comprise the team. So management, I mean, these are huge undertakings. There's a task force leader, management, plans, operations, logistics, and then we have search and rescue, the medical component, and technical search issues, and that's very high tech. They have kind of gone through using drones, which has improved search capabilities for widespread disasters, robots for difficult to get to areas that they'll kind of deploy in a confined space and just let the robots go and see what they can see. And the entire the entire organization is organized under the incident management system. And here's another very important fact, is that the mission is to assist, and I underscore assist, the local population. Whatever mission it is, when these teams come in, if the team comes in with the mindset of we're the elite and stand aside and the cavalry is here and we're taking over, that team will be doomed to fail. And we have seen that in action where, you know, people have had to get a little bit smarter about teamwork to assist the local population. When we responded to Katrina in Louisiana, that was so very important because it was very difficult for the local teams to ask and to receive help. We had the same thing with the World Trade Center, actually, because it was such a devastating loss for the city of New York to have all of a sudden not be capable of, not because they couldn't, but because it was so big that they needed help. And so we really have learned with this and have been fortunate to have task force leaders that see the value in truly understanding the idea about teamwork. This is kind of hard to read and you don't have to pay attention to the names, but this is what our grid looks like for a type 1 complete task force roster. So we have safety officers, task force leaders, padded with 2 people at the top so that everybody can split. Search team, canines. We have 4 canines when we deploy because they are a very real part of the search and rescue mission. Heavy rigging to be able to work heavy machinery. We deploy with structural specialists who usually are civilians. And then over here, our medical managers, our docs, 2 doctors deploy with every full type 1 task force with 4 medical specialists. So the medical specialists, these teams are very heavily engaged with fire rescue response. So all of these people at the bottom of the grid, the rescue people, are just basically fire department. And our South Florida task force has about 27 fire department municipalities that we draw from. Our primary fire department is the city of Miami. Our other task force, South Florida Task Force 1, is entirely Miami-Dade. So that fire department runs their complete task force, and ours is an amalgamation of a lot of different municipalities. Let's see here. I seem to be having trouble advancing. Let's see, there we go. So the response requirements I mentioned, rapidly deployable out the door in 6 hours, and the team must be self-supporting for at least 3 days. That's key in a disaster response because usually when something happens, you have the do-gooders who all want to descend upon, just to use a hurricane as an example, we want to send people, we want to send medical people, we want to send whoever we can. But a lot of times those helpers are actually a hindrance because then they start to depend upon the locals for gasoline, food, etc. So it is truly a balance. The team has extreme sophistication with the ability to do search and rescue. And I mentioned, again, I'll emphasize, it is integrated into the disaster response. So there's a lot of discussion that goes on at the top to sift down smaller missions to all of the FEMA teams. Equipment has to be operational and the survival ability. Deployed, self-sufficient for 3 days. And in general, we have the expectation that we will be deployed for 10 days. The longest deployment was actually the World Trade Center, which wound up to be a 15-day deployment for us. And for Hurricane Katrina, we actually were deployed for a month, but it was split into 2. So the medical goal for urban search and rescue is to recover a patient, a live patient, in any way, shape, or form that is going to maximize the odds of full recovery to pre-entrapment status. So just think about the example that I first gave you. That was a travesty. You know, the patient was successfully extricated, but died. And medical management may have mitigated the things that went wrong after the patient was extricated. And there is a lot of research in international response to earthquakes in particular, building collapses, miners, cave collapses, lots of information that talks about bringing medical management to the patient. And that was a little bit different from some of the other disaster responses. You may be aware that we also have a DMAT, which is Disaster Management Assistance Teams. And those teams are kind of back from the ground zero focus, the rubble pile, so to speak. So patients are extricated and then handed off to them. But the medical team function is supposed to be on site at a rubble pile. Now, when I first heard the priorities of the medical team, it blew me away a little bit, because our priorities are to make sure that the entire task force is healthy. The support personnel are our priorities. And we have to be very aware about hazards during a deployment to be able to work through that. The canines, those are responders as well. And so I guess being a pediatrician, it's a little bit like veterinary medicine, because the younger children can't respond to us. But we are very lucky because we have a veterinarian as part of our team. And they also have actually VMAT, which is veterinary medicine assistance teams, which actually will go around to different task forces and assist the medical management if the canines are having issues that we exceed our abilities to care for them. And then finally, victims encountered by the task force. Now, actually, all of our deployments have mostly been search and recovery. The Murrah building was search and rescue. We went to a deployment in Puerto Rico with a strip mall collapse that was an explosion from a propane tank, and that was absolutely search and recovery. Though by the time that we reached the World Trade Center, that was additionally search and recovery. And Haiti was actually the very first time that we had gotten patients with our team were able to rescue 7 patients from rubble piles in different locations. I have always liked the medical team structure, because as a critical care person, part of my career, I was very attuned to more so even the emergency medical response, because I recognize the fact that without our emergency medical services, we're not going to get patients in our critical care area, from any kind of trauma or medical response. We needed to make sure that our emergency medicine folks that are on the front lines, that were capable of taking care of children. And so in this response, looking at the picture on the right, physician, paramedic, you can't figure out who's who. You can by the helmets, but just looking at the people, all the same. And there needs to be mutual respect. And sometimes that doesn't happen in our own emergency response, because there's the hierarchy of medicine, but in here, it is absolutely, we are on the same playing field. So other medical concerns, we are actively, as medical managers, involved with search and rescue in different capacities. Triage and initial stabilization is important, which those of you that are on this call likely are quite familiar with. And bringing medical management to anybody that we encounter before they're actually rescued. We don't want to have happen what happened to that patient of the Northridge collapse. And then we have to work together. How are we going to evacuate our patients and make sure that we know processes. So the minute that there's a deployment, the medical team snaps into action, trying to find out as much as possible about the disaster, where are we going to, making connections with the local people, what is needed, what are their abilities. I will never forget going to North Florida after one of the hurricanes and getting a list from the incident support team. Here are your local resources. And when we started calling the numbers, they were, don't bring anybody here. We're flooded. We have no electricity. We have nothing, no water, nothing. So disasters have loss of basic services and oftentimes just utter chaos. And that, just, it is mind-boggling to realize that there are so many moving parts to most of these things. And the disasters have non-selective victim processes. That was overwhelming. They're ingrained in my head is the picture of the firefighter with a limp infant with the response to the Murrah building in Oklahoma City from that bombing. It was a travesty because that impacted a daycare center, and that was absolutely just shut down a lot of the local resources. So there is a race against time, because in a major disaster with building collapses, your best bet of getting people out is going to be within 24 hours, which is oftentimes unlikely when there's a big major collapse that's going to demand a lot of heavy equipment to get to patients. And it is very, very risky for response personnel. So I will blaze through a lot of these pictures, but how we get there has to organize. Is it regular just planes at local Miami International, working with the Coast Guard, working with the United Nations, which we did in Haiti. And this is, everything on the team has to be palletized. The team travels with 55,000 pounds of equipment that has to be taken down, set up, packed up, and everybody needs to know where it is. So it functions like a fine-tuned machine. When we travel by ground, we travel with something that the firefighters would call the bomb, which is filled with gasoline, because we're going to be ready to hit the ground with whatever is needed for generators. You don't even know exactly what criteria you'll have working wherever it is that you're going with transportation. So the medical team assists with unloading of equipment. There is no job that we don't do, and that's tough for sometimes the physicians on the team, because you want to start taking care of patients. You want to do what we are trained for, but that might be sweeping the floor in a tent. But that's the mission at hand, and that's what needs to be done. So I mentioned the fact that we need to collect as much information as possible and to try to get a sense of what kind of victim characteristics will we have. Is there going to be crush injury when we get there? So we set things up, and it's a continuum of care, because when you first get to somewhere, you don't really have all of the niceties of working with your base of operations or BOO. You've got to come up with schedules. You have to track equipment. And at the World Trade Center, one of the roles of the medical team literally was just kind of schlepping equipment to the rescue specialists that were working on the rubble pile. And all the while doing that was monitoring all of the task force members, because you can do that when you're actually side by side on the rubble pile. And if the medical specialists or medical managers are starting to feel a little bit dry and dehydrated, you know darn well that the rescue specialists are feeling the same. This was a development. This was at the Katrina in Mississippi. Anything can be used. People go in front of the disaster to try to find places. This was the main base of operations. This is kind of what the medical tent looks like. So we practice to train with the team and put up the medical tents. This looks pretty classy. We don't always have it this well set up, because it kind of evolves over the course of the deployment. And all of these blue boxes that you see, I can tell you that we got a lot slicker from the time when I joined the team in 1994 to now, because when I first deployed, we were throwing medications into backpacks, and if you'd asked me for an aspirin, there would be no way that I could have told you where it was. So we kind of evolve and have some of the comforts of home, because you can see a fan here, and you get better set up knowing where things are. However, at the end of the day, you don't know if you're going to come back to what you were set up as, because that nice little medical setup went away. When we were out in the field during Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita was coming, and those that were back at the main boo had taken everything completely down and had to move, because we were in the path of another hurricane rapidly approaching. And just lots of things that you can think of. I mean, you probably went through some of the other talks, listening to, things that we don't often think about, but hygiene, showers, bathrooms, contaminated water. That's a huge problem. You're not going to brush your teeth at night when the water's contaminated unless you're using bottled water. Decontamination. This is one team with 80 people is a lot of people to feed. We get very used to eating meals ready to eat, or MREs. And hygiene, you don't always have the little setup for hygiene. And it's kind of, this might not be wilderness. This is more urban collapse and where am I going to do my bodily functions? We get very classy. We were kind of ramped up in Hurricane Katrina, and our task force provided the meals for many of the other task forces to just try to lighten their work. So that, again, loads of moving parts that get organized. Processing of the deceased. We worked in New York City. We worked with the morgue that had been set up. Transfer of patients. If a worker was injured on site working, we would help get them off the pile and get them to one of the set up disaster management assistance teams that were more already set up with cots and the availability to do whatever they needed to do. They were set up to suture. We traveled ready to suture, but we made a decision that that would be better done if they were kind of taken back to one of the already structured and ready to go set up, so that we did not need to do that. The medical team has to know victim search assessment markings. This became a problem in Haiti because internationally there are international search markings, and different teams were using different search markings. So what you're looking at just here, for example, when you enter a structure, you put a cross and you put your task force right over here when you're entering. And when you are leaving, you slash through to make the cross, and you put your exit time, you put hazards, and you put whomever you found during the search. Structural markings are a little bit different. This means do not enter, the structure is unsafe, and you've got to be aware of evacuation signals. The World Trade Center, we were buzzed off the center, off the rubble pile several times because of the concern of another explosive device or whatever it was. But you need to be, it's not something you can say, well, let me stay here. So on-site difficulties, whatever it is, whether it's a tornado or a hurricane or a region, everything has its own sort of ambiance and environment. And these collapses, loads of rubble here, loads of mud, and searching to try to find whomever that we can. Critical infrastructures can be decimated, and this happened in Hurricane Katrina. Just look at the pictures. That is a sitting duck for hazardous materials issues. Floating debris is dangerous. Knowing something that can be also dangerous. These are like vortexes over manhole covers. We had people searching through the water, dropping into manholes that did not have their covers on anymore. And so you have to learn how to, kind of search. And honestly, as a physician, at the World Trade Center on day number 1, they asked, are you going down on the rubble pile? And I said, yeah, after I watch somebody else go down, I'm gonna learn, I'm gonna watch my safety officers, and I'm gonna watch the rescue specialists, and I am going to learn. I mistakenly thought that firefighters all knew how to function on rubble piles, and I learned quickly not so. Search and rescue is kind of a different skill set. Vectors, crocodiles, snakes, the mold you'll see coming up, access. You cannot just simply start walking through the water, and you have to be aware. These are things that I learned just by working with the task force members. You have to be aware that these hanging wires can be live wires, and that can be just absolutely deadly if those live wires go into water. I included this just as a kind of a laugh, because for the federal rescue teams, all of these little people in here are circled around, and it cracked me up that they are rescuing a cow. And so it just struck me funny that even the animals have, innocent bystanders. So you may not have seen this type of information on the news, but this was one of the storm surge lines that we had gotten from a helicopter, and literally containers from the water rose up over structures and got deposited on the other side of them because of the storm surge. And so it just, either they were rolling and they decimated everything in their path, or they floated right over and were encountered after the fact. And the storm surge can do this, and the hurricane winds can actually, this was more water damage here, but in a Hurricane Michael that we went to, you would see the same picture, and all of those trees were snapped like toothpicks because of the wind. So inherent response problems with gas access. This is a fire station, worthless. They could not respond. They could not take care of their own. And I honestly forget whether this was Louisiana or Gulfport, but we had to work with the locals, because it is just devastating to want to protect their own environment and not be able to do that. Getting to a disaster is also, this is why you need plans and logistics. They're calling ahead. Our structural engineers would be traveling and get out before we went over a bridge, and to make sure that there was actually an entrance and an egress point. And these little boats here kind of give you an idea about the storm surge, and you can see that even in South Florida. And just massive rubble. And a lot of these containers were filled with chicken. When our team first arrived, there was a lot of just greasy chicken, and someone made the probably not so swift decision to start searching at night. And we quickly realized that that was not going to be safe for the task force members. So safety is a priority. You have to, everything is a balance and a burden, just like it is in critical care. You have to balance. If there's a victim that's entrapped, we're gonna treat that a little bit differently than if we're searching a building that may be unsafe and there is no sign of life in that building. In Louisiana, we were actually doing a secondary search because most of the buildings had been searched on the 9th Ward, but the water level was so high, they could not come back and traipse through the buildings. This was just typical of what one would find inside the households. And we did find, again, as I said, it was search and recovery. And citizens took refuge in the attics. There was a lot of human waste. The heat index was off the wall. And I will switch gears a little bit here because a disaster involving compromised structures, collapsed structure disaster, you can look through and see just the fact that this is just a huge safety issue. Now, here's I will talk about this, and then I've got a number of pictures coming up. This is what the medical team trains for. Patients survive if they're treated early and aggressively in the rubble pile. So what we're looking at is we're looking for crush syndrome. Crushed muscle is a hodgepodge of acidosis and hypovolemia and renal failure. And so you try to start treating very early on site. And you need to remember the fact that it may not be something crushing the victim, it just may be the body weight. So just, you don't need me to go through every slide about this, but when you look at this picture, there, it is just complete chaos, and there can be large numbers of victims. Hazards are absolutely commonplace. Looking at this, there is rebar, there are void spaces. This is, you have burning fires at the World Trade Center for over a week after it happened, and we were in search mode for at least through the first week and into the second week. Loads of issues, and we want our task force members are our top priority. Switching gears to the earthquake response, different structures. So we're going to expect that there are going to be like different characteristics of the collapsed buildings. Working in an international environment, we were in 3 car accidents on the way to our embassy, and you have to also think about force protection because people get scared. And in Haiti, there were burning fires, there were burning bodies to try to dispose of victims. So Haiti, look at the building structure, and that just, we have to treat that differently. And I mentioned the international markings. This was our team in action at the collapsed Caribbean supermarket. We found 5 people in here, and these markings on the top part of the building indicate that there was no one there. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody did a lousy job. It may have meant that the victims were just not found, or they were too quiet, or they were sleeping. But we had found people, and this is what we have to train for. I'm not sure that this projects very well, but there are 2 patients here. One whose face has been washed, and the other who's just totally cluttered with dust. And so it's a tandem of rescue and a tandem of medical you can see that they started care here. This is Dr. Chin from one of the California task forces doing treatment on site. Again, underneath, shoring is important with rescue. And this is what we were able to get our last 2 patients down and out and worked on within the building and then transported. And so you have to go with whatever is available, because this does not have, we didn't have the usual ambulances to be able to transport. And night ops, this was where we actually were able to do an on-site amputation. Haiti was the first time that most of the task forces had that happen. We trained for that, but it's not really done, and we were not able to get a patient out, and we accomplished that with the amputation. Hazmat, decon, that's absolutely critical, that every mission at the end of the day, we're doing rapid decon. I put this in just as a joke because evacuation mentality, this is so true. Who knew evacuate? It's sad because it puts teams at risk when people do not evacuate. And the many hazards, it was tough getting somebody off this rubble pile in a safe fashion. And again, health and safety concerns. We're fortunate to have a tent and actually the ability to have sleeping bags out. I wanted to show you from my lousy experience, this is an absolute rescue don't. Here is myself and my medical coordinator standing there without masks. And it was just not possible to just keep that mask on. We decided that we were doing that without. It is psychologically stressful. One may be living in austere conditions for the entire 10 days of the deployment. It is exhaustive. It's not just a 12-hour shift. It's much longer than that. Debriefings are key, and we would try to have huddles and pass off any information that we got and snap rest at any juncture in time. Public health concerns add to the difficulty. We started not eating anything if it was not an MRE and delivered, because gastroenteritis and poorly prepared food can take out a task force. This is for the people, but there's crowding conditions and on-site difficulties is a slew of everything. And again, as I mentioned, we are self-sufficient for a good 3 days, don't need anything. But as soon as possible, we would start resupplying, whether that be medications or whatever. And here is an example of what poor, I shouldn't even say poor, I don't mean it that way. It's, you do what you have to. But when there's a disaster, this was the medical tent from the University of Miami Project MetaShare. Things started coming in. This needs logistics, because people will say, oh, we didn't have what we needed. We don't have that medication. But somewhere in here, once it starts getting organized, so the faster that people can start doing logistics, the more prepared you're at. And it was very devastating to have a patient intubated in the field in Haiti and get to the medical tent and to have them say, I'm sorry, we can't support the patient because we don't have ventilators. The usual things for the task force members are manageable. Hydration, prevention is key. Thankfully, all of our deployments, we have not had, knock on a million pieces of wood, not had a serious task force issue, because we have adhered to safety. Fatigue, hydration, key. And mental health, I love Snoopy, but paying attention to the task force at hand, watching the workers on site, attempting to do the best, getting sleep. And for those of you from Miami, our task force is very attuned to taking the Cuban coffee maker with us on every deployment, so that we have that, and you would be amazed at how helpful that is. And I'm finishing training. I am fortunate to continue to work with a bunch of the firefighters. This is a rubble pile, and we train on this. And this could be unsafe. These are not safe. These are thrown together so you can run into problems. But reality is training. So you want to train like you're going to see. And this actually was our amputation station. To be able to work in the confined space and to do the things that we usually do in our emergency rooms on a rubble pile when it isn't quite so comfortable. The future, training, exercise realism, we had to make adaptations to thinking about COVID concerns. We're getting so much more refined with the capability. They're talking about doing ultrasound now on deployments, combining knowledge from wilderness and military medicine. The military has taught us a lot, and resources. So I apologize for racing through the end, but I wanted to give you a time to fire away with any questions that you may have. And it has been my pleasure to share my passion, that I feel I have been made a better physician for having the ability to work side by side with very talented fire rescue personnel. Thank you.
Dr. Cantwell, thank you so much for giving such an amazing talk. I don't like to speak on behalf of everybody, but I feel like I can when I say that was really amazing and really eye-opening in the ways that like a physician can enter, make an impact even in like disasters at home. I have a couple questions to kind of get started, and then everybody can put questions in the chat box as we keep going.
Shall I stop sharing?
Sure, it'd be nice to see you.
Okay.
Perfect. So one of the questions that we had is, I know that you have military background, but do you have to have or be affiliated with the military to be involved or work with USAR, or can you join as a civilian?
You can join as a civilian. And the only thing, so when I mentioned that I wanted to write the Navy a thank you note, I really did, because I felt like as a physician, my job in the military would have been doing physical exams at a recruit station. The USAR team opened up a whole can of being able to do things like really on site that I just found just beneficial. I mean, it was, it was a little terrifying at first, but loved working in confined spaces. And by training in confined spaces, there have been some physicians, civilian physicians, who have joined the teams and said, this isn't for me. I'm going to pick the disaster management assistance team. I'm not into crawling through tunnels. So whatever component, and if any of you have questions about hooking up, you can check with your state, because some of the states have their federal, if you can think back to the map, you can reach out to the state teams online. If you just Google USAR, you'll find it. And the physicians, most emergency medicine, trauma surgeons, there's an ophthalmologist in California who's excellent, but it sort of depends on what you're interested in. Some of my group thought that I had absolutely lost my mind for being interested in this. But I just so appreciated being able to function as that. And even as a pediatrician, I would always tell the firefighters that I felt quite capable of doing it, because they're like a bunch of little kids when they get together.
Great, thank you for that.
Civilians, absolutely, yes.
Awesome.
And the only thing the military, I meant to tell you, what that experience taught me was USAR is hurry up and wait. And that is totally military, because that's the USAR team.
Got it. So we have a question from Ryan, who's at CU School of Medicine. He was asking if you could talk a little bit about how you coordinate being on a disaster response team with your daily work.
So that's an excellent question, because when we deploy as the medical manager, when the team deploys, the expectation is that you are gone for 10 days. So that part is very much like the military. Sometimes teams have been fortunate in being able to get people in and out with private transportation or just using commercial flights, etc. But the expectation should really be, I'm with the team, I'm gone with the team. That was difficult because when I deployed to the World Trade Center, the University of Miami has been most supportive. I had talked to my department chair and the dean and said, I'm kind of passionate about this, and this is something that I want to do. And they're supportive. And my group was supportive. So I'm the division chief, and I told them that when I get a call, I just need to somebody needs to fill in and out the door. And so my group was supportive of that mission, because I didn't want to start calling people up and trying to line up calls for 10 days. I think it's doable, but it's more complicated when somebody's working in a community hospital with a different schedule like that. So I am very fortunate to have a group that is supportive. But the mindset wasn't always there, because when we were deployed to the World Trade Center, we wound up in Homestead, Florida, which is very close to the hospital. And initially people kept saying, well, can't you come in and, can't you help out, doing call? And I'm like, not exactly. My mission with this team is I have to be here for the team.
Great, thank you for that. One of the questions that I had submitted before is, I know you deployed to Haiti. How often does a USAR deploy internationally?
So ours does not. Haiti was, and I'm blanking out. Virginia is an international team. And I noticed that somebody from Colorado Task Force is on here. I don't know whether you know the other team, because I am totally drawing a blank on the other team. But there are only, in the United States, only 2 at this time that deploy internationally. Sometimes what happens is you'll get smaller groups, like City of Miami Fire Rescue has sent smaller groups to international responses. And in Haiti, we just deployed because Haiti was so close to South Florida, and we have such a large Haitian community that both South Florida Task Force 1 and us deployed. And the difference with Haiti, which was a little overwhelming, was that since it was an international response, there were so many more moving parts than the usual incident management team from the United States, because now we were working with the international USAR, and it was just a little bit different than we were exposed to. So we were working with task forces from Mexico and Turkey and a bunch of other places. And in fact, one of the jokes in at the World Trade Center was somehow the Mexican task force, the Los Topos, the tunnel rats, had actually made it to the World Trade Center before our task force did. So we were a little bit dismayed that it seemed that Mexico was able to get there faster than we could on our own turf. But the transportation was a problem, because we literally waited from Tuesday to Friday before we got a go ahead to say you're driving to New York, because there were no flights. So we don't expect to deploy internationally. But as I say that now, I have to retract that, because Hurricane Dorian, they did go to the Bahamas. So a smaller group of people did. It is more the exception than the rule.
Got it. Thank you. We're going to do maybe 2 or 3 more questions since it's about 6. I don't want to keep people too late. What do you think the job turnover rate is for positions on the team?
So I'm probably considered the antique on the team, and there are rampant jokes that, like if I kick off, they're going to be like weekend at Bernie's, that they're just going to take me around so they have a physician. We're very fortunate now that we have about 6 physicians on the team. There was a lot of interest and then lack of interest, because like I alluded to, the response can be a little bit boring at times, and hurry up and wait, and what is our mission, and what are we doing here, because you want to rescue patients. Search and recovery sometimes can get a little drudgery, and for physicians, even in Haiti, we actually deployed, our team took 3 physicians to Haiti, and there was one of the physicians wanted to get into the University of Miami tent and do medicine. There are a lot of people, they need help. Even in the hurricane response, physicians wanted to break off and go to one of the disaster management assistance teams, because there were patients to treat, and we're back here doing vital signs, making sure that the team was safe, just checking on basic things. So in that sense, there is an attrition. You're lucky when you can get the steady enders that are kind of on the teams. And so I think different teams have different experiences with attracting some committed physicians.
Got it. Thank you for that. I'm going to ask one more question, because a couple people asked it. You spoke about how the team is interdisciplinary. And so a couple of people asked if there are roles for people like PAs, RNs, NPs on a USAR team.
So maybe. The nurses and PAs on our team are also paramedic firefighters. So the structure of our team is focused on, since it's heavily weighted paramedic firefighters, those disciplines are kind of like go to those disciplines first. Civilians, structural engineers, absolutely the civilians will come in with that. It doesn't hurt to reach out and ask. But specifically, I am a nurse and I want to do something, it probably would be a little bit more difficult to get on one of the USAR teams as a nurse without the capability of having some of the other disciplines or experience. If the nurse happens to be a canine handler, then their role as a civilian canine handler would be in a large part devoted to running the dogs on the disaster response. But it never hurts to ask, because I wouldn't want to shut people down to just kind of explore and see what's available, or even reaching out because some of the state urban search and rescue teams may have a need for those disciplines as well.
Got it. I'm actually going to ask you one more question so everybody can get to know you a tiny bit more before we log off. Somebody asked, when you're not on a mission, what do you do on a day-to-day basis?
So first of all, the missions are really few and far between. You know, you'll go like for very extended periods of time. So right now, I no longer cover critical care service on a day-to-day basis. My primary specialty is pediatric critical care medicine. So over the years, my 9 colleagues now function in our 24-bed mixed PICU, CICU. My role now has morphed into being the medical director of our pediatric palliative medicine team. So that comes with ups and downs because to me, I don't feel like I'm doing anything different than I did in the ICU doing palliative medicine, because I think palliative medicine is good, sound medical care. It's not just end of life. It is, you know, kind of devoted to being another layer of support for children who have life-threatening illnesses. So I have been able to use the task force into helping us, because we now do field trips for our patients that are in the ICU or whatever, and the fire department comes to the hospital and kind of does mini Make-A-Wish. We'll take children to the Miami Seaquarium, to the zoo, we'll get them home, we'll go to the beach. We'll take patients on paintball missions if they're demolishing a building with this paramedics, SWAT medics, to just try to give our children who are critically ill an experience to give them the impetus to attempt to get better. And so administration with being division chief and working with supporting the staff, you know, just over the last several days, we have just had an unfortunate death from a 16-year-old who did not survive a heart and liver transplant and was in the hospital for basically a year. And dealing with staff, because that's a huge thing for staff. And then helping another 13-year-old get into hospice with metastatic Ewing sarcoma. Those have started to become my daily work.
Got it. Thank you so much, Dr. Cantwell. Thank you for sharing your life and sharing your experience and your knowledge. Thank you everyone for coming. That was amazing. And hopefully, I don't want to keep anyone too late or keep you too late, Dr. Cantwell. But if anyone has any more questions they think of, Dr. Cantwell graciously agreed to answer them, and I will forward them to her. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your evenings, and hopefully I see you guys all next week for our talk on marine envenomations. And yeah, have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you very much to everybody. It has been my privilege to, you know, be able to speak in your forum.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.